Well, utilitarianism, as I said, is an extremely influential moral theory. In other words, even though it was developed in the 19th century, or at the end of the 18th and the 19th, there are still many secular moralists today who consider themselves basically to be utilitarians. And I said it was a response to, among other things, Humean skepticism about morality that says, well, we can look at an action and we don't find any vice in the action, any quality of moral wrongness empirically. And so Hume says, well, the only thing that ethical judgments mean is that they are reports about our psychological attitude toward a given action, whether we approve or disapprove of it. In other words, Hume claims that the only thing we can find empirically, if we say that, stealing is wrong or murder is vicious and has that quality of vice or moral wrongness, the only thing we can find is no quality in the action itself that we can label moral wrongness, but an attitude within us. Well, this basically made morality relative to any given person's attitudes toward various actions. And it wasn't just religious moralists that reacted against this type of extreme skepticism in morality, but it was also secular moralists. Kant in Germany had his own reply to this type of skepticism originating from Hume regarding morality. But the reply of Bentham and of John Stuart Mill is basically in line with empiricism. In other words, they thought if we can get morality down to earth, take it out of the realm where we're talking about intangible moral principles that aren't detectable empirically by examination, say, of a given action. If we can get it out of that realm and bring it down to earth, then basically they thought we can show once again how we can actually reason about a moral matter. Because as I said, it's not only religious but secular moralists who did not go where Hume wanted to take them, who did not go to the sorts of subjectivism that made morality relative to individuals and that basically nullified any chance to reason about a moral matter. And Sartre is accused of having just that kind of subjectivism, that he makes morality a matter of the choice of individuals. So utilitarianism basically took refuge in an old theory, hedonism, developed by the ancient Greeks, but Bentham gave it a universal quality that, in other words, the old hedonists were more concerned about an individual's pleasure or pain, whereas Bentham and Mill said, no, what we ought to be concerned with is promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In other words, pains and pleasures of anyone affected by what we do. Now, when I was a kid, I went through various science phases one of which was my chemistry phase, and I had a little chemical balance like this. You might recognize it, although I would think most things are digital now in chemistry labs. But you know, the way you would weigh something in an old balance like this is you'd put a weight that had the weight of the chemical you wanted on one side, and on the other side you would measure out the chemical till the weight and the chemical balanced. And this is a really good metaphor because utilitarianism says to figure out the rightness or wrongness of an action, we need to balance out in terms of the results of doing that action, the good versus the bad consequences. And the morally right course of action is the course of action that on balance has more good than bad consequences. So that's why I put a chemical balance here at the beginning of the slide presentation. Now, we didn't talk about ethical egoism, although there's a term paper option that covers ethical and psychological egoism. But they, along with utilitarianism, fit into a broad class of moral theories called consequentialist theories. And so what consequentialism says is that the only factors that are relevant to the morality of what we do, whether what we do is morally right or wrong, are the results that are produced by doing that action. So it holds that only consequences are relevant to the, when I say the moral quality of an action, I mean whether an action is right or wrong. And so consequentialism asks us to weigh the results of what we do to figure out whether it's morally right or wrong. And let me point out something in passing here. When I did this little graphic, it's not an accident that all the C's, that of course stand for consequences, are towards the right. That's meant to suggest something. Think about it. Where are the consequences of our actions located? The past, the present, or the future? Right? We do the action now, but the consequences follow after it, right? So consequentialism, as part of the nature of what it is, focuses only on the future. It makes anything in the past morally irrelevant. And that, for some people, is a criticism of it, because if I might want to take into account things like whether I made a promise in the past and that should affect my moral decision, or whether we ought to reward someone or praise someone morally for something they did in the past. You know, for consequentialism, the past is morally irrelevant. So egoism and utilitarianism, though, even though they're both consequentialist moral views, and the big trick in ethics, I used to do a lot of vocabulary when I taught specific ethics courses, is, trying to get a handle on the terminology. But if egoism and utilitarianism both focus on consequences, it raises the question, well, the consequences for whom? And they differ in the way they answer that question. For ethical egoism, the only consequences that are morally relevant are the consequences for the person doing the action. In other words, the consequences for me are the only important consequences. The consequences of what I do from an egoist perspective, whether it be good or bad for you, are, the consequences for you are irrelevant morally. And this leads to some very counterintuitive things like, if I'm a dishonest repair person, but I can benefit by asking you or recommending a repair that you don't really need, but I will profit more from it. Egoism seems to say, seems to defend the moral rightness of that kind of an action, and that makes this a controversial view. So if this person, I guess, in Brown is the doer of the action, notice I have the consequences attached to that one person, whereas utilitarianism says no. The consequences for me and how what I do affects me do count. I count in the mix. But Bentham's famous phrase here is, it sounds like the Three Musketeers, but it's not. He says, for purposes of utilitarian reasoning, each is to count as one, but none for more than one. In other words, the results as they affect me, if I'm the doer of an action, do count in utilitarian calculations, but no more than the results of anyone else, the results that pertain to anyone else affected by what I do. So utilitarianism, was much more appealing to a lot of philosophers and remains so today. Now, one of the interesting things about this theory, I mean, think back to Descartes. We saw that Descartes thought he could found the whole of philosophy and sciences on one principle, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And we saw even in geometry, the whole system flows from a few simple concepts like things equal to the same thing or equal to one another. The interesting thing about utilitarianism is when you try to say, what is it as a theory, the whole theory is based on one principle, and Bentham did talk about what he called the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. Bentham did talk about it as if it were an axiom. Now you'll notice I have Solomon here, but probably the page is a page from the old Solomon that's up there in 527. By the way, I still am waiting for somebody to return my other copy there so others can borrow it. But so it's probably not the same page in your text. In fact, it's around the 550s. Bentham's on 557. So the principle of utility, this is from a different text, always acts so as to bring about the greatest net good for all those affected by your actions. Or simply always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we're concerned that what we do has a positive effect, all things considered, on those who are affected by our actions. Now, the thing here is, in these general definitions, while they capture the principle of utility, they leave it open what is to count as good. And as I said, the The original founders of utilitarianism, you see Jeremy Bentham on your left and John Stuart Mill on your right, adopted hedonism, the view that the good is to be defined in terms of the promotion of pleasure and or happiness. Think of them for the hedonists as being interchangeable, and the lessening of pain and unhappiness in all those affected by our actions. Or if we're talking about a policy decision for, the society as a whole. So hedonism then says that only pleasure or happiness is good for its own sake. And on page 557, you find Bentham's original definition of the principle of utility left it clear that he means moral goodness to be defined in terms of pleasure and happiness. Here's Bentham's own words. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever. In other words, we can judge any action by this principle. And here's flowery 19th century language or 18th century language. According to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. He says, I say of any action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. So his original intention, and that is what turned out to be the case, is that he wanted people to use utilitarian reasoning not only to work out and work through ethical dilemmas in their own personal lives, but he wanted utilitarian reasoning to be used, as we saw in that illustration in the video, to make public policy decisions. Should the government, build or not build a huge hydroelectric dam? Well, utilitarianism says let's weigh the costs versus the benefits of doing so. Oh, yeah, go.
I'm trying to grasp first thing, the view that only pleasure is good for its own sake alone.
Here's the way one ethics textbook I used to illustrate this. What we want is pleasure as an intrinsic good, not as an instrumental good. An instrumental good is good only if it promotes some other good, but not good in and of itself. But if you're talking about the ultimate standard for moral goodness, and that's what they're talking about here. In other words, they're trying to get morality down to earth by making it to be concerned with the pains and pleasures, the happiness or unhappiness of real people in the real world, and that we have some contact with, and not something ethereal. But to illustrate the difference between intrinsic and instrumental goods, somebody might say, well, it's good to eat healthy foods. And somebody might say, well, why is it good to eat healthy foods? And one reply you could give is, well, so if you have a healthy diet, people who eat healthy foods are generally healthier themselves. So eating healthy foods is good because it promotes another good, that is good general health. But suppose if you went on to say, well, why is it good to be healthy? Now, you can give a lot of different answers to that question, but one answer you might give is, well, you know what? People who are in good health lead happier, more satisfying lives, more pleasurable lives than people who have a lot of health problems. And so, you know, being healthy promotes the good of having a happier, more pleasurable life. But then, if we would go on to ask, but why is it good to be happy? Or why is it good to have a pleasurable life? For the hedonist, the buck stops there. You know, the answer is, well, you don't want happiness or pleasure as an end or goal because it leads to the promotion of some other good. This is where the buck stops. You want it for its own sake. And so, I mean, whether we agree or disagree with them, that's what they're trying to say, is we're going to define moral goodness. You know, there's all kinds of terminology that I wouldn't get into. It's called a definist theory because it defines moral goodness in terms of some non-moral natural property. This approach is also called ethical naturalism. And in other words, the happiness and unhappiness of individuals is a natural property in this world, right? And so you're defining moral goodness, which seems to be an ethereal, non-natural property, in terms of a natural property, namely the promotion of pleasure or happiness and the lessening of pain and unhappiness. You know, and you can disagree with it. And to people who are normally used to thinking about morality as concerned with things like the will of God, the commands of God, or the way Plato did, thinking there are just simply forms. There are ultimate standards in another realm beyond the senses for ultimate moral goodness. Remember, the form of the good. This approach is going to seem very different, right? Here we're defining moral goodness as you know, some property in the natural world. Now for a while, this approach totally fell out of fashion. You know, because of a philosopher named George Edward Moore, who raised the question of whether you would commit what he called a naturalistic fallacy, that you know, no matter what you define moral goodness as in terms of a natural property, you can always ask, well, why is the promotion of that good? In other words, you never really reach an end. You know, so a naturalistic approach to ethics fell out of favor in the middle of the 20th century, but then it was revived in the 60s and 70s. So, and here's, you know, why, you might say, well, why hedonism? Well, quoted in that video was another famous quote that Bentham gives at the beginning of his book, The Principles of Morals and Legislation, or an introduction to them. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do. Right? So he says, look, we all, you know, are subject to pain and pleasure. And, you know, that's one reason why he takes this as the ultimate standard. Mill tried to prove hedonism. I'm not going to stick on this slide very often, but it commits what we teach people in logic is a fallacy of ambiguity. Um, he basically says, well, that pleasure is desirable as an end can be seen from this, that is the one thing people actually do desire. He says, well, if something's audible, that means it's able to be heard. So if pleasure is actually desired by people, then it is the sort of thing that it is able to be desired by people. The point is, in the premises, the word desirable means is able to be desired, meaning one, as I say here. But what he needs to prove is that pleasure or happiness is desirable in the sense that it is what we ought to desire as the ultimate end of morality. And he never proves that. In other words, he goes from desirable with one meaning to saying, well, that means it's desirable in the sense that we ought to desire it. And so he changes horses in midstream as far as the meaning of desirable. And there's an interesting side note here. Mill wrote a textbook in logic that was used quite extensively in the 19th century, and yet here he is in his own writing committing a Logic 101 error. Now, Mill was Bentham's star pupil, but back to Bentham. A lot of theories, even in the sciences, when they initially start out, when they're initially advanced, are advanced in a fairly simple way. And what happens, yeah, I know you had to leave. What happens is various problems come up with the theory and they have to defend it against objections, and the theory gets more complicated. Bentham originally thought that when we're talking about pains and pleasures for utilitarian reasoning, the only thing we need to worry about is how much. How much pain, how much pleasure are we talking about? In other words, the word here is quantity. We can reason about pains and pleasures quantitatively. Now, the word calculus may scare some people, but there's a, I see students come in here who's taking it, right, and they've got a book that's 4 inches thick, that they're carrying around. If we talk about a happiness calculus, Bentham thought we could reason things out in a very objective way. Now, there's another meaning of calculus, which is that any system within which you can make calculations can be called a calculus. And it's in that other meaning that we're talking about Bentham's hedonic or happiness calculus. But we're going to look at how you might reason something out with a very simple example. But for Bentham, then, all we need to worry about is the quantity of pleasure an action produces, or the amount of pain if it's a negative action. For all concerned. So from his standpoint, all pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same. His famous saying is, quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin's as good as poetry. Now, from what I've read, pushpin is a British child's game that's something like pickup sticks. So you're saying that if you get as much pleasure from playing a simple child's game as you do from reading Maya Angelou or some highfalutin poetry, right? Robert Frost. It's the same, right? And this opened utilitarianism up to some criticisms later. Now, your book uses the word happiness calculus on 558. It's also called the hedonic calculus or the hedonistic calculus. But basically, you'll see all we're doing here is adding positive and negative numbers. So if you remember that from your middle school math, you're going to be fine, right? Now, so he thought we could compare pleasures and pains quantitatively. And here again, it isn't that Bentham thought that we would get out our calculator, well, they didn't have them in those days, but that we would do a lot of calculations to decide whether we want peach cobbler or apple pie for dessert or something like that. But he thought that in weighty matters, like consider a case where a judge during the sentencing phase of a trial is tasked with trying to figure out a fair sentence for someone who's just been convicted of a serious crime. And so you want a sentence that is not too light, that might lead to recidivism and not deter anybody from the crime. Maybe not rehabilitate the offender, but you also don't want a sentence that's way too heavy. And wouldn't it be nice if that person had a very objective way of just punching in some values and calculating things objectively? This was kind of the thing that Bentham was thinking about. Now, how hot is it in this room? It's fairly comfortable, right? We'd say it's probably somewhere in the 70s, maybe, or high 60s. We can talk about how hot or how cold it is. Objectively, we can quantify how hot it is in this room because we have a countable unit, or in the case of temperature, more than one countable unit, right? We can talk about degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius. You know, how many degrees Fahrenheit is it in the room? Well, Bentham thought if we're going to talk about pains and pleasures quantitatively, we ought to have, in parallel with that, a unit of measure. Uh-huh. Yeah. He had, now see, his critics basically thought he was too optimistic in terms of the possibilities here, but he thought we could actually assign numerical values to our pains and pleasures, or to the projected pains and pleasures of people affected by what we do, and then calculate things out. Well, I mean, this turns out to be a real problem because, it's subjective plus, I mean, a thing that the empiricists tried to say is we have Cartesian privacy. In other words, there's an access that I have to the slight pain in the shoulder I have right now that you don't know anything about. Now, you could surmise it from my behavior if I said, Morawski has a pain in his left shoulder from stupidly motorcycle racing when he was a teenager. And wiping out, right? You know, and the guy I was racing had a near genius IQ, you know, so both of us were acting stupidly. You know, being intelligent is no bar to doing stupid things when you're a teenager, right? So at any rate, yeah, this becomes a real problem because we don't have access to others' pains and pleasures. And in other words, if to figure out the right thing to do, you have to predict that accurately. Well, how do you know that? And think about poker players, right? I mean, part of the skill they have is having what's called a poker face, right? Trying to mask their actual feelings, right? You know, they have two kings as whole cards, and a king just came up in the flop, and they're sitting there, you know, and then, you know, privately, deep within them, he's saying, oh boy, I flopped a set of kings, you know. But outside he's, you know, because he doesn't want anybody else to know how strong a hand he's got, right? Or she. And so, yeah, it's you raise one of the issues with this. Now, this is an old thing that I got from what then was the best encyclopedia of philosophy. We may have the printed edition in the library, I don't know. But it's a simple example. And I was standing at 10 o'clock at night in front of the Civic Arena downtown, waiting for the 27 bus. And the circus had just let out. So you have all these tons of people coming out. You know, we have the circus in town. Suppose you're somebody who has a nephew, a young nephew, and you're trying to think about options for Saturday night. And one option on your table is to take your nephew to the circus. The other option you're thinking about is to stay at home and read a book that you have been wanting to get to, right? So this shows you how you figure out pluses and minuses. And you're not an egoist. You're not thinking just in terms of yourself, but what's the best for all around? Well, suppose you've been to circuses before and they don't interest you anymore, right? Been there, done that, and you're going to be bored. Well, now this also lets you know something about what Bentham means by pains and pleasures. Really, any type of unpleasantness, I mean, boredom is unpleasant, gets negative hedons. What I meant to say is the countable unit he came up with is a hedon, where plus one hedon is a unit of pleasure and minus one hedon is a unit of pain. So suppose the uncle's going to have minus 5 hedons worth of boredom while the circus is going on. Nonetheless, sympathetic pleasure is pleasure you get, like if you had a younger sibling, or some of you may even have young children, they get a birthday gift or something over a holiday, and you get pleasure from seeing them get pleasure opening their gift. Well, we call that sympathetic pleasure. So if your nephew enjoys the circus, you'll get some sympathetic pleasure out of it. But then suppose your nephew really likes the circus. Call that plus 10 hedons. I mean, your sympathetic pleasure isn't very much, but now if you do the math, right, it's plus 12 minus 5, which is plus 7 hedons for taking your nephew to the circus, right? Now, the other option, and you know, one of the problems with utilitarianism is, where do you stop in figuring out relevant factors.
Where's it going? Where's it going, Professor Moreau? I mean, is there an equation for me to like be at the perfect level?
Yeah. Well, we're getting there. So you read a book at home, right? Suppose an adult doesn't get quite as much pleasure as maybe a child at the circus. So plus 6 hedons worth of pleasure for reading the book on Saturday night. But while doing it, you disappointed your nephew. So you have minus 2 hedons worth of sympathetic pain in your disappointment at disappoint. And then there's the nephew's disappointment itself at minus 8. So you do the math over here and you get minus 4 hedons, right? So now it's not always a plus versus a minus. It could be a plus versus a bigger plus. It could be a minus versus a bigger minus. In euthanasia decisions, utilitarian reasoning is often used where it's the difference of, to justify, they try to get euthanasia legalized by saying, well, you're balancing out the pain of 6 months with end-stage cancer versus the much less pain of getting, a needle in the arm, so people ought to have the option of euthanasia, is the argument. Now, of course, there's a slippery slope argument against this, saying, well, if you legalize it, are people going to be subtly pressured to do the right thing rather than cost the state or their insurance company more money by keeping them alive for 6 months? So it's not always a plus versus a minus, but here it is. And note, for the uncle, if he were an egoist, here the uncle actually comes out worse by choosing the second option. By choosing taking his nephew to the circus, right? The uncle's boredom is minus 5 and plus 2, so he's minus 3 himself by taking the nephew to the circus, whereas if he had stayed home and read a book, he would be plus 4. But he's not an egoist who thinks only of the consequences for himself. He's a utilitarian who wants to take in the consequences for everyone affected. And so when you figure into the mix the impact of these two actions on his nephew, taking the kid to the circus turns out to be the thing to do. Okay. We're already talking about some of the problems here. Is this really unrealistic? Again, they're subjective, pains and pleasures, not open to public inspection. Also, standardizing on a countable unit. If you look at the definitions of some of the units of measure we work with, they're really technical as to what counts as a yard and a foot and stuff like that. Can you really get an objective standard for what is to count as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure? And the point is, if you don't know what's going to count as 1 hedon, how do you know how many hedons you have? You have to have clear, so that's a problem. What Jonathan Glover said in the video is the same thing that's said here. We do make rough and ready comparisons. I can say my headache is much worse today than the one I had yesterday. Hospitals even have a chart of 1 to 10, but still they understand those are subjective determinations. To say I can roughly talk about having a worse headache today than yesterday isn't to say that I have an objective way of assigning numerical values to those two different pains. So Bentham's original way of doing this, to think that we can do it in terms of countable units was a little too ambitious. Okay.